Doctor and radio host Emma Lloyd gets a taste of her own medicine when a man decides to get back at her for ruining his future marriage. However, they end up falling in love despite his plan. In the opening scene, various women in New York are listening to Emma Lloyd's radio show, even calling to talk about their love problems. One particular caller asks Emma where she can find a majestic love, but Emma assures her that she doesn't want the type of love that would take the oxygen out of her lungs. The caller wants a passionate love, but Emma goes in on her, demanding of her to be selfish and to look for a man friend rather than a boyfriend she'll have to take care of. Among the many women listening to Emma's radios is Sophia, Patrick's partner. The caller asks how they'll recognize the right man, and Emma gives her some advice. The man has to be responsible, equal, loving, and an adult, which are all the things Sophia realizes that Patrick isn't. After playing football with his colleagues, Patrick gets in a car with them while Sophia leaves alone. As they're changing the stations, trying to find some good tunes, they come across Emma's radio show. Unexpectedly, the caller that calls in is Sophia. She confides in Emma about having second thoughts days before the wedding. Upon revealing that she's only known Patrick for 5 months, Sophia is made fun of for rushing to get married. Even though Emma doesn't directly tell her to call off the wedding, she alludes to it by giving her some advice, and claiming that almost half of the marriages end in divorce. The whole time, Patrick is listening, and the fury can be seen on his face. The following morning, Emma is woken up by her soon-to-be husband with breakfast in bed. Her fiancé is also her publicist, so he reads some of the reviews of her book. All the critics seem to be loving her book, even some of them calling her a koja. Continuing to read the newspaper, they're delighted with the kind words used for her, but some people aren't. Patrick is furious to see the woman who ruined his future getting praised. Further down the sidewalk, he spots Sophia walking, so he tries to get her attention. He begs her to talk to him, given that she hasn't returned his calls, but she asks him to leave her alone. Stopping the truck, he offers to take her where she's headed, but she enters a market just to avoid him. Having had enough, he takes the Vector and asks her to come out. Finally, she comes out with the story, only to tell him what he's already heard. This time, however, he is sure that they're over for good. A heartbroken Patrick walks back home, after having his life ruined by some woman who doesn't even know him. Unaware of the consequences of her advice, Emma continues her radio show. Walking into the restaurant in his building, Patrick is greeted by the restaurant owners, who invite him to dinner. However, Deep asks everyone to leave the man alone, given that the woman he loves has left with no explanation. Patrick chuckles and kisses Deep on the head before heading to his apartment. On his door, he sees the article about Emma ripped out from a magazine, and knows where to go immediately. Going down the fire escape stairs, he jumps through the window into Ajay's room. They spark a conversation about Emma, and when Patrick asks who would ever marry her, Ajay comes up with a great idea. Ajay pulls up Emma's official document in the city, and suggests getting revenge by getting her married to Patrick. Despite wanting his revenge, Patrick is hesitant at first, but Ajay motivates him to do it. It doesn't take long for Emma to find out the following morning as she tries to get the paperwork so she can marry Richard. The employee lets them know that they could change her status by filling in some paperwork that the husband has to sign. They exit the building, and Richard seems to be more upset than Emma. He goes over the things he has to do, and the fake marriage just isn't something that he needs to stress him out even more. Cupping his cheeks in her hands, Emma assures her fiancé that she will sort everything out, before getting into a taxi and going after Patrick. Upon arriving at the address, Emma enters the Indian restaurant, where the family greets her. Given that Patrick is at work, they show her the way to the fire station. Walking up to one of the firefighters, Emma scares him accidentally, which is why he splashes her with water. It turns out that Patrick isn't at work either, so she heads to a bar, where she finally meets him. As she enters the bar, Patrick notices her, and immediately ducks so he isn't seen. His friend recognizes Emma, and can't believe that she's there. As Emma walks up to his friend Larry, he gets up and reveals himself to her. Knowing what she's there for, he avoids talking about it, and instead, they make her play pool and have a couple of shots. She reveals that she's getting married, but before she can get to the problem, he announces it to everyone so they can cheer. Trying to change the subject, he pretends to recognize her from her radio show, even though he knows her perfectly. With irony, he mentions that his girlfriend loves her show, and when she asks him whether it has helped, he assures her that it has, a lot. She starts by mentioning that she's getting married, but Patrick warns her to be careful, as almost half of the marriages end in divorce. Pouring her another shot, he interrupts her once again, but she lets him know that she doesn't want any. However, a couple of shots later, Emma seems drunk out of her mind. Patrick suggests he calls her a cab, which is when she finally informs him about being married to each other. Despite knowing what's up, Patrick acts oblivious. Drunk out of her mind, Emma ends up hitting her head and falling, so Patrick takes her to his apartment. With her on his shoulder, he walks into the apartment and sets her down on his bed. Going to the kitchen, he grabs an ice pack for her head and lets her sleep over. The next morning, the loud nature of New York wakes her up. Realizing that she's not home, she gets up quickly and starts panicking. Shortly, she finds her way out and flees after seeing a thank you for last night note on the door. Rushing to the station, she catches the train and arrives at work. As she enters the office, she is greeted by her assistant, who has forgotten to bring her emergency outfit. The assistant informs her that she has 6 missed calls from Richard, so she asks her to put him on the line. Entering the office, she doesn't notice her dad sitting in the corner of it, with her mom's dress next to him. However, as she answers the call from Richard, she lies about sleeping over at her father's, and he even helps her once she sees him. She tries to resolve the situation with Richard when Patrick calls her on her phone. Going back and forth through calls, Emma finally gets Patrick on the phone, and as they talk about the previous night and the documents, he appears in front of her with the papers. She thanks him for doing the deed, but she's rushing to get to her cake testing. Given that Richard won't be going, Patrick takes the chance to invite himself to the tasting, so he gets in the car with her. Patrick loves the buttercream cake and even makes a big deal out of it. Once he finds out that the cakes are free, he orders a glass of milk with them. Emma seems to be embarrassed by his behavior, but he continues to enjoy the flavors, even mixing some of the cakes for a new taste. Wanting to cleanse her palate, Emma orders milk as well, so Patrick orders a glass of milk for everyone. Turning to the ladies opposite them, he offers the new cake creation, and even orders one for every table. As if that's not enough, he goes into the kitchen to help the staff. Emma is annoyed by his behavior, but the lady from the other table finds him amusing. As he returns, the lady asks how they met, so he mentions kickboxing. Knowing where the story will go, Emma stops him and tells the lady that they met on a blind date. They were on separate blind dates that went horribly, which is why they noticed each other. Wanting to make the story even more believable, Emma lies about her favorite song playing when he asked her to dance. The women across the table ask about the song, out of curiosity, and Patrick chimes in by singing, "Every Woman in the World." The rest of the women join in, and soon all of them are dancing while singing the lyrics to "Every Woman in the World." Emma shuts it all down, so they continue with the cakes. After the cake testing, Patrick takes her to a notary so they can finish with the papers. However, she isn't aware that Deep is the one that'll be finishing their work. As they walk into the booth, Deep decides to try the cake first, but Emma begs them to hurry up, since she has to get to her book party. After checking the papers, Deep informs her that it shouldn't take them more than 10 minutes, but Patrick motions for him to say more. Already late, Emma decides to leave, promising that a messenger will be sent to collect the papers. As she leaves, Patrick opens up to Deep about starting to like her, but he doesn't let him even think of that. The night falls, and we can see Emma rushing to the party. As she enters the room, all the flashes go off. After taking some photos, she finally gets to Richard and informs him that the deed is done. The party goes on, so Emma heads to the bathroom to fix her makeup. As she's lining her lips, the German lady from the cake testing appears next to her. Emma recognizes her, but gets terrified once she finds out that the woman is Karl Ballenbecker's wife. Mrs. Ballenbecker admits to dragging her husband to the event, given that he doesn't like socializing with people whose business he's about to liquidate. However, she assures Emma that everything can be fixed once her husband meets Richard for dinner that same night. Emma refuses, but the lady doesn't take a no for an answer. As they exit the bathroom, a woman comes up to Emma asking for his signature, when Mrs. Ballenbecker spots Patrick. Emma is just as surprised as the lady to see him, but is thankful that he's come at the right time. As she hugs him, she asks him to play along and pretend to be the real Richard. Mr. Ballenbecker quickly comments on his casual attire, so Patrick reveals that he's just come from soccer practice. Surprisingly, they start bonding over football before the real Richard decides to join them. Not knowing what's up, he pulls his hand out to introduce himself as he is, but Emma squeezes his hand and lies about him being her brother Karl. Patrick hugs his little brother, and Richard couldn't be more annoyed. Having had enough, Richard pulls Emma to the kitchen to clear things up, and she reveals the whole truth to him. He begins stress eating, unable to bear the information he just received. Not wanting to be her silly little brother, he tries exiting the kitchen to clear his name, but Emma stops him. Finally, she reveals that they're planning on liquidating his firm, so he agrees to go with the plan. They look through the kitchen window and see Patrick having a good time with them, which is good, because he's saving Richard's career. However, just a couple of seconds later, Richard notices that Patrick's gone. Remembering that they have dinner plans, Emma runs to find Patrick to tell him about it. After searching, he's nowhere to be seen, so she decides to call him. Fully transparent for the first time, she admits that her life and career are at stake, and ends the voicemail by saying that she needs him that night. At dinner, we can see that Patrick isn't there yet. Luckily, Richard calls Emma asking her for updates. Through code words, she pretends to get the news that someone's been hit by a cab. Right as she's about to say that it was Richard that got hit, Patrick appears in front of her, so she lies that it was Karl. Mr. Ballenbecker comments on Patrick being late, but asks him to join them regardless. However, Patrick lets him know that he's a family man, and that family comes first for him. Instead of having dinner, he invites him to a family party, which they seem to love. Colorful lights shine bright as they arrive at the Hindu bar mitzvah, ready to celebrate Ajay's maturity. The party is unlike anything they've been to. From performances to party tricks, many different acts go on entertaining the guests. Rhythmic music plays as Emma and Patrick dance with each other. She thanks him for everything, and admits to thinking differently of him. They lean close to each other, and the tension is evident. Right as they're about to kiss, she pulls back and runs off. Almost immediately, she calls her dad to pick her up. She spends her night trying to relax in a hot tub, while looking at the henna tattoo she got just a couple of hours before. Patrick receives some good advice from Ajay to fight for Emma. The following morning, Emma enjoys some of her father's pancakes while ranting about her hectic life. All of a sudden, a young girl walks into the room, agreeing that Wilder's food is great. Having enough of his shenanigans, Emma collects her stuff and heads to the door. Wilder warns her about jumping to conclusions and assuming the worst, but she doesn't listen to him as she exits the door. Later in the afternoon, we see Richard and Emma discussing wall colors for their new apartment. Richard avoids talking about the previous night, so Emma mentions it. He claims that everything must have gone right, since the contract got renewed for another 5 years. He hopes that they can put the situation behind them after filling out the documents. Feeling guilty, Emma sits down and admits to not having the papers. Richard realizes what Patrick's doing, so he promises her to get the papers himself. A few days later, we see Richard approaching the football field, where Patrick is playing a game. Richard asks for the papers almost immediately, but when Patrick says he'll drop them off at Emma's desk, he gets serious. Richard asks him not to call or text his finance, since they have a life that doesn't involve him. However, Patrick keeps his cool and doesn't let it get to him as he shuts down the accusations. Wanting to get her out of his life, he decides to trash everything he has of hers except for her book. Instead, he decides to read it carefully before showing up at the radio station. As he gets to her office, he calls in to critique the book about not being helpful, despite claiming that it's a self-help book. He claims that her book is about hating the partner you're with, so they start bickering and going back and forth about whether they're good for each other. Surprisingly, Emma hangs up the call, which is something she's never done to a caller. Ending the session, she runs after Patrick and catches him at the elevator. Their bickering continues in the elevator as well, with her calling him unsuitable. Having had enough, Patrick stops the elevator and shows his fire department badge, asking everyone to exit the elevator. Being the only people in the elevator, he asks her whether she thinks he's unsuitable, but she informs him that she doesn't think of him at all. Instead of explaining, he decides to show her what unsuitable means, so he pins her to the side of the elevator, kissing her passionately. She gives in as well, so he stops the elevator with his firefighter keys. Unfortunately, their moment is interrupted as the workers call through the speakers, asking them to stop. Wanting to escape the lobby, they run up to the top floor, where he leans to kiss her once again, but she stops him. Reminding him that she's getting married soon, she breaks his heart, but he understands. Instead of making a fuss about it, he hands her the documents, and they separate peacefully. As Emma arrives at the dinner later in the evening, Richard notices something different. She shows him the papers and assures him that they won't be seeing Patrick anymore, but Richard asks her why she's not happy about that. Not knowing how to answer, they move on to another topic. Richard hands her the custom-made rings, and she claims that they've made it incorrectly. The ring is vividly the way that it's supposed to be, but instead of seeing "I do," Emma sees "do I." Reading the room, Richard assures her that they're perfect for each other, and that he is sure he wants to marry her, but if she's not sure, then he's not going to force her to marry him. Picking up the documents, he leaves in a hurry. Emma spends her days at her father's house. One day she wakes up and sees the same girl from before, in her robe. She calls out for her father, asking him not to let his younger girlfriend wear her robes. However, an elderly woman exits the room and informs her that the younger one is her daughter, and that she is her father's girlfriend. As they prepare breakfast, all things are cleared out, and Emma apologizes for assuming without asking. Seeing how happy her father is, she asks him what he thinks about Richard. He gives her a bland answer, that he's just like she wanted. Not hearing what she wants to hear, she asks him to give her a second opinion, because she's losing interest. Wilder gives her exactly what she wants by telling her that Richard is her safe bet. In the pouring rain, she walks to Patrick's house, ready to be honest about her emotions. He sees her through the window walking into the Indian restaurant, where she's greeted by the family. As she arrives, they ask her to join them for dinner, but Deep, being the poet that he is, asks them to let her get to her true love. Finally, Emma arrives at the apartment, and as he tries to bring her some dry clothes, she stops him and starts addressing him. Unable to wait any further, he attacks her with a passionate kiss, and they spend the whole night making love. The following morning, Patrick goes to shower while Emma tries to make breakfast. She ends up burning the waffles, and as she opens the trash can to throw out the burnt bits, she sees news articles of herself. Looking through all of them, she finds the invitation to Patrick's former wedding, and assumes that he's married. Feeling betrayed, she throws the papers in his face as he stands in the shower, water dripping down his body. Immediately she storms out of the apartment, with him following behind her. Like Richard, she finally gets that the delay was completely intentional. However, she now thinks that Patrick is a stalker. She starts cursing herself for almost calling off her wedding and running her relationship for him. Finally, she stops at his begging, so he asks to show her something. They get closer to a window of a saloon, and he points out Sophia, his ex-girlfriend. He explains that she is a huge fan of hers, which is the reason for their breakup. The only thing he wanted to do was to educate her about running the lives of the people she didn't even know. He admits to everything, even for wanting revenge, but before he has a chance to say that he had fallen in love with her, she leaves. She returns to Richard, and they bring their engagement back on. Instead of finding the right person, she now suggests her listeners find the guy that is enough for them. Patrick, on the other hand, can't seem to get her out of his mind. A lot of time goes by before he even calls her, but the night before her wedding, he gets the courage. In the last 15 minutes of her show, he calls in, and she is surprised to hear him. To be completely honest, he tells her that he's fallen in love with her, of course indirectly. However, everyone recognizes that it's him, and Richard finally realizes how much they like each other. The following morning, the beautiful bride Emma seems to be nervous. Her father comes to her rescue and reminds her of what they've already been through in life. The altar fills more and more as people arrive, but the bride can't be seen anywhere. Looking at herself in the mirror, she finally realizes the mistake she's about to make. As she takes out her ring, Richard knocks on the door with a bag in his hand. Everyone leaves so they can talk. Richard pulls out the marriage papers that he didn't take to the city office and admits to knowing that he's already lost. He knows he should have married her a long time ago, but also wants her to be happy, which she won't be if she marries him. They hug each other tightly, and he even offers to deal with the crowd for her. However, as he checks how many people are there, he gives up. Wanting to leave in peace, Emma grabs some of the papers and lights them up next to the fire alarm. The alarm goes off, sprinkling water everywhere. The poor guests exit the church in a hurry as Patrick's firefighter crew is called. The firefighters protest about being called in a district that isn't theirs, but the man informs them that they've been requested. As Patrick parks the truck in front of the church, Emma runs out with the biggest smile on her face. Getting closer to her, he asks her what's up, and she pulls him in for a passionate kiss. Unexpected for a wedding, she rides off with the firefighters in the truck. A couple of months later, we see Emma talking to her listeners about having the wrong perception her whole life. She never thought that two different people could be together, but her father advised her not to sweat the small stuff. As they go to their sponsor, Emma hears a knock on the glass door. Turning around, she sees her man, and it brings a huge smile to her face. She knows that he didn't come to see her, but rather the belly, so she makes his wish come true by getting up and showing him the progress of their first baby. Who would have thought that the two people who didn't like each other would end up falling in love?